Ah, smell that burning sulfite. G'day folks, Ziggity here. These are the glorious sights and sounds of a Mercenary Grenadier in Path of Exile 2. Just one of the many playstyles possible on the very flexible Mercenary class. Now just a note before we continue, this footage is from Act 1 and 2, filmed hands-on at the GGG studio when I travelled there to host the Q&A just last week. This isn't a build guide, it's way too early for that. Anyone giving you a build guide is kind of like yanking your chain a bit. I, like many of you, want us all to explore the beta and figure out builds together. Consider this instead just a primer, a showcase, just a taste of one playstyle of the Mercenary that might inspire one of your builds or help you decide what to start as. This video will contain some minor spoilers like minor boss fights and locations, but no story elements. Also keep in mind that while this is some of the most fresh Path of Exile 2 footage you'll see, until the beta is out, it's still subject to change. Also, I did want to note that there was a bug here that's likely already been fixed as I'm recording this, where the Mercenary doesn't turn when reloading or winding up an attack. It's kind of just a visual thing, it didn't really affect the gameplay, but it doesn't quite look right, and Jonathan specifically pointed it out to me. It was working fine in earlier builds, but something broke and they had to fix it after I left. And with that, I'm very excited to share some of my experiences with the Mercenary and Grenadier playstyle in Path of Exile 2.
Always some sort of ritual going on,
Most of the time in PoE 2, you will choose your own skills through the Uncut Gem system, but the first skill is pre-made for you on the beach, and for the Mercenary, that's Fragmentation rounds. Effectively, a shotgun. This shoots many small projectiles in a spread that can indeed shotgun if you get closer. And the damage is substantially better if you do get up point blank, unless the target is huge, in which case you're probably going to hit them anyway. Fragmentation rounds has some fun interactions with frozen enemies that we'll talk about later, but it serves as a good intro to how the crossbow works. And fundamentally, this class plays very differently to any other. Crossbows are preloaded, but mostly fired nearly instantly. Every other weapon, whether it's a bow or a hammer, have some kind of wind up to them, right? But with crossbows, you're already loaded and ready to go, you just click the button. The downside is, of course, that you do need to reload, and each skill is effectively an ammo type that you can reload or swap to separately. Default attack is an ammo type, and so is fragmentation rounds. Pressing the load button will either reload that magazine or swap to it. A loaded magazine of a skill type, like fragmentation rounds, will persist even if you swap between multiple different ammo types as well. So you can preload everything and then swap between it quickly. This has a pretty few interesting effects. For example, you pay the mana cost when you reload, not when you fire. Again, very different to most skills. So you can spend mana reloading before you even begin combat, effectively investing your mana into preparing for the upcoming fight. And I put emphasis here on preparing, as that's really the Mercenary's main theme in a nutshell in my mind. Preparation. Mercenaries usually have an arsenal of weapons and tools that will be prepared and expended over the course of the fight as needed. A well-prepared Mercenary will do well, while one that is unprepared might find themselves overwhelmed. You load ammo types by pressing the load button for each skill, but to fire your crossbow, it is all the same skill, the same button. The fire button. It takes a moment to kind of adapt your mindset over to this unique playstyle, but I found it very natural over time, and in some ways, simpler. If I wanted to shoot, it was always the same button. I'd just use other hotkeys to change what my shoot did. Other skills like grenades do get their own separate hotkeys and don't use this like ammo loading system, so you do get a bit of a mix of playstyles down the line, but the fundamental crossbow experience is ammo swapping and blasting. Whenever you fire the final round, the character will automatically reload unless you do something that interrupts the reload, like for example a dodge roll. And I did find myself doing this a bit at first. Each skill has a different amount of shots before a reload too, so the shotgun style skills typically have just one shot and then they'll reload. They get that pump action kind of feeling, while the spammier skills can have many shots before they need to reload. Some crossbows and passive skills can give you additional shots to any reload skill though, so that's a really big deal on things like fragmentation rounds where gaining one additional shot means halving how often you reload. You know, you get to make a double barrel shotgun instead. There's literally a support gem called double barrel. The first 20 minutes on Mercenary Crossbow is, as you probably suspected, a little bit awkward. The combination of adapting to such a different playstyle and having only a few skills with pretty frequent reloads means that you do have to be pretty careful to not get overwhelmed by enemies. You may also find yourself dodge rolling or swapping ammo types before you auto reload, leaving you with empty skill magazines when you kind of need them. Take things slow and steady at first, and try not to spam your skill hotkeys like you do with other classes. Crossbow mercenaries reward a bit more of a considered non-spammy approach. Things get way smoother as you go, as you'll get faster reloads, various support gems that can help in a bunch of different ways. You'll get more rounds in your magazines, and utility skills that will also change things dramatically. And also there is just that element of getting used to this playstyle. I was pretty nervous in those first couple zones in Act 1 that I was like, I don't know if I'm going to like this, but I ended up loving it by the end. You get your first uncut gem in town where you can make your own choice of skill, and while explosive grenades is very tempting, I went with Permafrost bolts, and I highly recommend it as your first skill. I'm not telling you what to do, but this is basically an ice shotgun with a huge multiplier to freeze buildup. And Mercenary doesn't, by default, have any mobility at all, except for moving while shooting, right? Especially in the early game. You can take things from other class, trees and stuff like that, do like a weapon swap, leap slam or something, but in the early game, you just walk around with your crossbow, right? But what you can do is stop everything else from moving. Freeze is incredible in Path of Exile 2 in my opinion, thanks to the freeze build-up system. Everything will get frozen eventually. You don't have to like do some mega hit of damage and bypass some sort of threshold to have a percentage chance to freeze or something. Each shot builds up more and more freeze from 0 to 100%, and then they're frozen. It's as simple as that. More cold damage and freeze effect just gets you there faster. Permafrost bolts are wicked satisfying, and you can run around with them just blasting away by themselves. They do a bit less damage than the fragmentation rounds, but freezing and shattering everything well makes up for that in my opinion. That said, when you do freeze something, you can actually swap to fragmentation rounds for their true purpose, to make explosions. Even before we get any grenades, we can begin exploding. Frag rounds detonate the ice on a frozen enemy, creating a pretty powerful explosion. It's great for blowing up packs of enemies, but this does remove the freeze and let them start moving again, assuming they survive. So I actually found it better to not always detonate the freeze on a single target like a boss. The main strategy I enjoyed was blasting primarily with Permafrost bolts most of the time, and then whipping out the frag rounds to detonate when there was like a frozen enemy or two in a pack of other enemies. Freezes last a long while, so a lot of the time you can freeze one enemy, then freeze another, and then detonate both of them. As soon as you get a choice of support gems, which is pretty early on, I recommend putting Piercing on Permafrost. Being able to hit and freeze multiple monsters far more effectively makes this skill go from okay to amazing early game. After that, anything that interacts with freeze or adds cold damage is going to be great. Added cold or ice bite, which adds cold damage to all of your other attacks when you freeze an enemy, really good. But early on I used Frost Nexus, which creates chilling ground to slow enemies when you freeze someone for even more crowd control. Fragmentation rounds I didn't often use too many supports on in the end. I just used it as a detonator skill. But it's probably best built for damage. I used double barrel just to get an extra shot to detonate more frozen enemies before I had to reload. It costs you some reload speed, but it's kind of an okay trade-off here. Something like bleed or just any added damage would work fine as well. So you can get explosive grenades pretty early on, and these do what you imagine. They explode. After a fairly long timer, they do a nice explosion that deals physical and fire damage. My early experience with them was that they have a pretty long timer and do supplemental damage at best. This is something that Jonathan mentioned is possibly kind of changing a bit. Damage-wise, they might be going up. Early on, I found them only really useful for larger groups of enemies and for preloading some damage before you engage with a pack. You can kind of pop them out and then run over and then shoot them with your shotgun, and then the grenades will start blowing up. As soon as you can grab multiple projectiles support though, which lets you shoot out 3 of them at a time for substantially better overall damage and area of effect, they do start to shine a bit more. Added fire is also good, but you can use the less duration support too to lower the timer and make them detonate faster with no downside. Explosive grenades get better later on when you get poison grenades to combo them with too as well, so we'll see more of that later. Now, far better early game, and when a grenader started to feel like a thing for me, was when I got the flash grenades. As soon as you can get these, do get them. They deal physical damage in a large area, they have a short timer, a massive increase in stun effect, and they blind enemies.
Blind him!
With multiple projectiles support, they are incredible at stunning huge groups of enemies and even bosses in 1 or 2 throws. So you can get a lot of those heavy stuns on bosses to get some nice damage cycles off. They do only have 1 charge to begin with, but later on you can get an extra cooldown with the Grenader passive, which is just incredible. The skill has a small downside though. You blind yourself with them too. kind of funny. With multiple projectiles and increases to area of effect, you will blind yourself all the time. I certainly did. But I did actually just find it to be not too major of an issue. It's like, you do lose some evasion, and accuracy didn't really seem to matter. I was still hitting things just fine. Certainly, it's not ideal, and you'll try and avoid it when you can, but I did find it a worthwhile trade-off for how strong the skill is. Flash grenades with multiple projectiles quickly became a main skill for me, and were used off cooldown as much as possible. The stun, the damage, the area, the speediness of their detonation, all amazing. I did use some stun supports with it too, but because they're already pretty high stun effect, it's probably better to use things that increase damage or area or cooldown instead. It's just the area of effect support, for example. Now, here I am teaching you how to blow things up in the Path of Exile 2 beta, but I know many of you are already planning on blowing up your job, your career, your future livelihood, etc. as you sink deep into the loot grind, you know, missing call after call from co-workers, bosses, family members, and emergency services, as you try each of the 36 Ascendancy classes as they add them to the beta, testing every skill in the 7 different endgame content like pillars that they're adding, not to mention more of them later, over 100 different bosses. And then there's like off-classing hipster builds and weapon swapping builds, and emerging from this beta as a functioning human it's going to be tough. But I do know a solution. You could learn back-end web dev with my sponsor, boot.dev. Learning programming languages like Python and Go, and getting started on a career in back-end web dev might seem pretty daunting, but boot.dev turns it into an RPG. So it tickles those same reward centers, just like getting a level up or a Chaos Orb drop.
Bloody beautiful!
You could, for example, do a zone in Path of Exile, get a level in a gear, and get some feel-good feelings, and then do a couple steps on a boot.dev course and level up there too. You'll get that sense of progression both in-game and out of it. I had no background in code, and I found the practical, just kind of write this code and see, look, here's how it works approach that they take with this to be super easy to jump into. And I'm a sucker for some good gamification. You can try it for free and learn some things, and then sign up if you think it's got some potential. Go from knowing nothing about this to getting a job in back-end development at your own pace. It's even got a course on actually applying for jobs in the field, so you can come out of the beta and survey the devastation of your life and smile upon the carnage, knowing that it's okay, you've got a plan. If you do end up liking the look of boot.dev, you can use my code ZiggyDGaming for 25% of your first month or year, whichever. Grab a month to learn a specific skill like coding in Python, or grab a year for a career, and get yourself a solid beta backup plan for your life. Back to the video. Once you get flashbang and explosive grenades going, you can almost fully go Grenader mode at that point, especially just kind of supplementing with Permafrost and Fragmentation rounds for some extra explosions in between. I did, however, end up experimenting with armor piercing and high velocity rounds. The armor piercing rounds is a machine gun fire skill that chips away at enemy armor. At first it's a very small amount, like 1 or 2 armor for the lowest level, but each level of the gem makes it destroy more and more armor per shot. This of course makes its damage ramp up itself, and enemies also will take more physical damage from any other hit. It's just going to be nice in parties for sure. When an enemy loses all of its armor, it becomes armor broken, and that's where high velocity rounds comes in. It's a big penetrating sniper shot that consumes the armor break on the enemy. It's a little strange, I know, but it does so to deal a large amount of extra damage. Don't ask me to explain how you can consume broken armor on an enemy which somehow returns the armor to them. It doesn't really make sense, but just don't think too hard about that. The point is big damage go boom. I found these skills pretty good for rare monsters and bosses, but not that useful for swarms, obviously. The faster attack support on armor piercing is obviously great for reaching armor break faster, and high velocity is all just about big physical damage, so anything that just scales up the damage is going to be great. While these skills were pretty good, they're probably for other playstyles. I think for the Grenader playstyle they didn't really make too much sense, as they were more focused on physical damage combinations. Lowering their armor doesn't really help you much if you're doing a mixture of damage types, like you're probably typically going to be doing with most Grenadier setups. So 2/3 of the way through Act 1, a side boss can give you your first uncut spirit gem, and they drop every so often after that point too. There are a few good choices here, but I wanted explosions, so I went for Herald of Ice. This reservation buff makes it so that whenever you shatter and kill a frozen enemy, they explode, dealing cold damage to enemies. This does nothing for most bosses, of course, but it's amazing for clearing groups and super fun, especially early game when you're using lots of that Permafrost bolt. It can be supported with added cold damage for free too. It doesn't like cost any extra spirit, and that just makes the explosions deal more damage. Great. Other support gems like accuracy support, for example, can work to boost your global accuracy, like adding an effect to the aura. It's quite neat, but those sorts of supports do increase the spirit cost, so that'll require some investment or getting extra spirit to use. Long term, I could see having Herald of Ice on most of the time, and then having a defensive spirit skill like Arctic Armor, Grace, or Wind Dancer to swap on for bosses. An interesting utility skill that popped up around the end of Act 1 was Rapid Shot. This channeled skill has a bit of a wind up to it, and then it rapid fires out a huge amount of bolts that also build up heat. Each stack of heat gives 10% extra fire damage to the skill. More importantly, however, heat also adds 6% of damage as added fire to any grenades fired. Heat does rapidly drop off when it's not in use, so you kind of get this unique combination of trying to fire a lot of these shots and build up the heat, and then very quickly put out as many grenades as you can with those empowered grenades. You can literally see the grenades like catch on fire from being empowered by the added fire damage. Pretty spicy combo, but the wind up and channeled nature of this does make it kind of difficult to pull off in dangerous boss fights, except when you get a stun or freeze, which thankfully we're quite good at here. So it certainly does work, and is a good way to punish the bosses when you get those moments. I used this for quite a while before dropping it in favor of the easier to use explosive shot combo I'll show you soon. But supports for rapid shot would likely be things like faster attacks and then anything to add damage or debuff the enemy. Gas grenade is where you start getting some more grenade combos, and it's a pretty fun piece of the puzzle. As a baseline, it's a grenade with 3 charges that releases a poison explosion and then a lingering poison cloud that grows. I'm sure there will be some poison-based setups that focus on those parts of the skill, but I'm excited about its other application. That poison cloud is highly explosive. Any burning ground effect, or including enemies burning ground effects by the way, or any of your skills or allies' skills tagged as a detonator, or that apply burning ground, can cause the gas cloud to explode, dealing a large chunk of damage. Explosive grenades work well for this, and it gives you more explosions per explosion. What a deal. Another fun bit of tech here is the Bursting Plague support gem that I kind of stumbled on here. Linked to the gas grenade, this causes enemies poisoned to also build up Plague. Initially I was like, okay, it's poison stuff, not relevant. And then I saw explosion. When the plagued enemies die, they explode. So good. And they explode for physical damage too, which is quite nice. So you can get explosions on your explosions alongside your explosions. Now we're talking. And speaking of explosions, some of those grenades do have kind of long fuses, and sometimes you want a bit more immediacy when it comes to your explosions, right? You don't have to wait. That's what explosive shot is for. It's a heavy hitting fire crossbow bolt that explodes on impact. Its real beauty though is that it also detonates any grenades in its area of effect. You can throw poisoned and explosive grenades on top of each other and then pop a quick explosive shot before the enemies leave the area and detonate everything. It's a useful tool to give you a bit more immediacy when needed, like against faster enemies that are charging you, and to kind of just reduce reliance on things like less duration support for grenade fuses. You can support it with any gems you want to make it faster to fire or reload, increase its area of effect, or give it more damage as a bit of a finisher skill if you want. But even unsupported, it's useful for popping grenades when needed. A handy little tool in our tool belt. So with explosive shot and a wide array of grenades at this point by the end of Act 2, I didn't really need any of the regular crossbow skills anymore, and I became a fully fledged grenadier. I did still kind of use Permafrost bolts on occasion, as I just kind of love it. Once again, this isn't a build guide, but I'll show you what my build was looking like towards this end of Act 2 period. In the end, I ended up linking explosive grenade to added fire damage and area of effect. Combined with the poison grenades, they were a spammable damage dealer in between flashbangs. Explosive shot was linked to execute as a pseudo culling strike against nearly dead enemies, and also to pierce, which I found quite helpful as it helped it explode where I wanted it to and not on enemies earlier, so that I could detonate grenades easier. Flash grenade was my MVP skill for sure, so we got the prized trophy of the multiple projectiles support. I was still using overpower for it at the end, which is fine, but in hindsight there's probably more effective options. Given that it's only 50% more stun build-up on a skill that already has 400% more, I mean, that's still a 12.5% increase in stun, but I imagine something just like area, cooldown, or damage related might be better in the end. I guess I could still see overpower making it into a setup with more support slots. I still had rapid shot with faster attacks and ruthless, but I mostly stopped using it because I always had grenades to throw. Gas grenades were linked to bursting plague and inspiration, as they're actually pretty mana hungry. And finally, Herald of Ice was linked to added cold and frozen vortex. Although vortex could only proc if I froze an enemy with another skill that then got shattered by Herald of Ice, so it wasn't super effective, just kind of like a free slot that I was testing. Later, I'd probably try and work in accuracy support once I've got some more spirit, especially since I'm blinding myself half the time. For the passive tree, I tinkered back and forth a few times, and I definitely changed things a lot more once I had more chance to explore. I traveled through Remorseless for a nice extra stun build-up and damage. Grenades do count as projectiles, and I think they scale with projectile damage, but I'd need to double check that in-game, which we'll have to wait until the beta, so take that with a grain of salt. I'd actually consider going through attribute nodes at the beginning of the tree too. I always kind of wanted more dexterity and strength for gems in gear, and the health from strength is legit too. But I definitely still get volatile crystals because area and cooldown is just immense on grenades. You want as much of that as you can get. The ricochet node is not a long-term node for grenadiers. I probably should have dropped it by this point, but I needed to highlight it because I do recommend taking it on any crossbow merc, at least initially. The shotgun projectiles that you miss with will like hit a wall and bounce back to the enemies. It's very satisfying, it looks super cool, and it's super worth it. Honestly, if the numbers were any higher on this notable, it would be an Ascendancy node. I traveled through some knockback, which was okay, on the way to some serious grenade nodes. This grenade cluster gives a bunch of nice small nodes and 2 amazing notables, so it's probably a must take. Cluster bombs gives you an extra grenade, straight up like a baby multiple projectiles. The downside is increased duration, which makes the fuses longer. It's a downside for sure, but explosive shot can detonate them anyway, and you can scale it down in other ways. It's pretty tolerable, honestly. Well worth the trade-off, I think, in my opinion. The other node, Grenadier, is a no-brainer, and it's good enough to name a build after. An extra cooldown is pretty nice on things like explosive or gas grenades, but it's insanely good on single charge one like the flashbangs. Throwing 2 sets of 4 flashbangs when you've got multiple projectiles and that extra grenade projectile is often enough to just outright stun a boss or delete whatever monsters happen to have you surrounded. Preparation is the name of the game for Mercenary Grenadiers, and this lets you be twice as prepared with twice as many explosions. The Adrenaline Rush node down here is some nice in-combat move speed, a big fan of that. And Volatile Grenades lowers the fuse time, and it's right on top of a jewel slot, which is very nice to get. On the left-hand side, I was headed towards Perfect Opportunity. This node looks very good. A lot of stun and lucky damage against heavy stun enemies, which if you don't know how that works, it rolls your damage twice and picks the higher number, so it averages you up. I think this is definitely something that we'd want to get if the flash grenades continue to overperform as they have been. There's a ton more stuff to explore here, obviously, that I didn't have time to look at. Though I did spy the Authority node, which has some big AoE and cooldowns, so I'd likely end up heading there. At some points we'll have to consider defenses more, but not worrying about life nodes on the passive tree was really nice and refreshing. Definitely enjoyed that. And I mean, explosions are a nice layer of defense anyway, right? For the Ascendancy choice, honestly, Gemling Legionnaire and Witch Hunter both seemed very valid as a Grenadier. Gemling just gives a ton of value across a lot of skill gems, which is kind of perfect for a cooldown grenade combo build, so if you want to use as many different grenades as possible, it's definitely worth considering. But the Witch Hunter is so freaking cool. The moment I saw it added another explosion to the build, I knew I was sold, right? Zealous Inquisition gives 10% chance to explode an enemy, dealing their full life as damage in a very large area. It's those big white X circles that you may have seen in my gameplay. It's very satisfying and effective. Whenever that triggers on an enemy, right, there's a good chance that it has similar friends around it, which means that 100% of its life is often enough to kill the other ones around it. If I had to say what I'd get later on from this Ascendancy, I'd definitely have to test Sorcery Ward, which it lets you turn evasion and armor into a shield to protect against elemental damage. Probably a pretty big deal. You can likely push it to some pretty high numbers too, from what I've seen. It's good to feel near immune to elemental damage, but we'll have to test that out at endgame. Witchbane might be my favorite node, behind explosions of course. We have some really nice crowd control between freeze, stun, and later electrocute on Grenadiers, and adding concentration breaks to that mix sounds amazing in boss fights. The node behind it lets you scale damage pretty nicely too. Concentration just effectively lets your damage lower enemy cooldowns, which can be amazing in boss fights. Nearly all of the scary boss moves are generally cooldown based. Culling Strike and Decimating Strike are nodes that let you kill things faster. Pretty hard to go wrong with that one. They're just flavored in a pretty fun way. And that last node, Choice Weapon Master, is 20 weapon passives, which lets you split your passive tree more between 2 different trees for weapon swapping. It's an unusual one, but grenades do seem like a potentially good candidate for weapon swapping. You might have one crossbow for crowd control effects to amplify those dramatically, and then another crossbow oriented around damage, for example, or maybe even like a spellcaster weapon to have some support spells. I don't know, it's really hard to say how good this will be until we like know all of the skills at our disposal and see how that all feels, but overall, I'm definitely a fan of the Witch Hunter for the Grenadier. After all, it's got explosions, and just about every node seems to be worth taking. In terms of gearing, I tried to get myself added cold damage wherever I could. Even just a little bit with the Permafrost rounds was very effective in the early game, and I definitely found myself prioritizing socketing added cold damage into my weapons. Though do keep an eye on crossbow type implicits. In particular, some of them give some nice bonuses to allow you to shoot more shots before reloading and things like that, and later on some nice grenade things. Move speed boots are huge on the Mercenary, so you definitely want to get yourself some of those. And I did find myself always in need of more dexterity and strength for gear and skill gem requirements. I don't know if this is just kind of like the nature of these hybrid classes potentially, but if you find a really nice like pure evasion piece, it can be hard to wear it unless you've got a lot of extra dexterity. So getting some of those can be quite nice. And I found that with the inspiration support on gas grenades and maybe just like a little bit of mana stuff on gear, just kind of picked up incidentally on jewelry, I didn't really have any mana problems on this build. I barely had to use my mana flask, and I always had charges if I did need to. So it definitely seemed very manageable, but it might have also just been down to kind of incidentally getting a fair bit of extra mana on my gear, for example. The only unique I ended up finding was Black Sun Crest, which is an attribute scaling armor helmet. Gives a lot of armor, and a fair bit of attribute scaling potentially is nice, especially for boosting that life. Competed pretty well against the rare helmets that I'd found at the time, but I wasn't doing anything like super unique with attribute scaling at this point. The things in general to prioritize most are move speed on boots, damage on your crossbow, and gloves and rings if you can get it, and making sure that you have enough attributes, and of course resistances in life as always. Now my gameplay strategy on this build at the end here was to open with a flashbang, and then follow with gas grenades and explosive grenades right after, and then some explosive shots just to detonate things, followed by another flashbang if needed. This keeps the enemies in place, lays down a large area of death and blows everything up, and then kind of like keeps them there a bit longer if needed to finish the job. But I will say moment to moment, it felt pretty fluid. Once you kind of get familiar with your loadout and the different tools you have and in which situations they work well, you naturally find yourself using things kind of tactically. Like for example, preloading gas grenades on an essence monster before releasing them. Now, I didn't really have a chance to incorporate it into my build too much, but right before I logged out, I had like a spare minute to just do a sneaky little look at one more skill. Just for a second, I had to. Voltaic Grenade does a lightning blast that builds electrocute on enemies, and electrocute is basically another hilarious form of stun. Being able to add this to our kit alongside flash grenades and potentially things like freeze is very exciting for this idea of like a crowd control grenadier. You could also use it to build up shock to amplify enemy damage taken, and you can use things like the innovate support to add lightning damage to the rest of your grenades. There's a lot of potential here for sure. I can see it working its way into the kit. Anyway folks, I hope you enjoyed this early look at the Mercenary and Grenadier playstyle, and maybe have figured out if it's a playstyle that you want to try, or I don't know, maybe it smoothed out your early game for you a bit. I'm very tempted to kick off beta with this build and see if there's like a lot of potential here for it to be a real banger beginner build like I suspect. Maybe something that I could make a guide for. It'd be really good, for example, to put up a beginner guide to a build that's just really fun for blowing up monsters for some of the new exiles joining us. But then again, maybe I should be playing one of the classes that's like polling as getting less attention, like the Sorceress. What if not enough people are covering them? I don't know, I'm definitely struggling with this deliberation. Let me know what you think. But that's it for now. I'm Ziggy D, and thanks for watching.